So welcome back, everyone, and we're super excited to get started tonight. So let's get started. Good evening. We're happy and excited to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion entitled Best Practices for Teaching Reading and Writing, Landmark Experts Weigh In. This is the first in a three-part series in the science of reading. We'll be discussing the science of teaching reading and writing and why Landmark School continues to be committed to best practices supported by research. In addition, we will be providing through this conversation best practices for teaching reading and writing, how the science of reading supports these practices and our instructional choices, and practical information for parents to become better advocates and supporters of their struggling reader and/or writer. The goal of science as it relates to reading is to have better outcomes for all children. The current discussions in the science of reading landscape speak to the importance of structured literacy defined as systematic, explicit instruction, and it being essential for readers who may be struggling. But what we know is that these best practices are actually great for all readers, regardless of if they're struggling or not. And in that sense, we believe that a rising tide of great instruction will raise all those boats. An important question in the field of reading research and instruction is, what do we know and what do we need to know? Again, I'd like to welcome those of you who may just be joining us as the webinar begins. I am actually thrilled with the panel we have for you tonight. And I'm sure by the end of the discussion, you will come to see how amazing these individuals are and how passionate they are regarding the work that they do day in and day out to improve the literacy outcomes for their students. You will notice that I am not narrowing my word choice to the word reading, but am purposefully using the term literacy. We have opened the lens of tonight's discussion to include both reading and writing, as their development has a natural reciprocity, meaning that the work our students do to improve their skills in one area ultimately improves the skills in the other. So now that we're started, some housekeeping. We are accepting questions tonight through the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And we hope that we will have time to get all of your questions, and we'll do our best to make sure that happens. In addition, tonight's presentation is being recorded, and we will send out this to all registered attendees by the end of this week. So let me introduce the panel, who represents 113 years of collective teaching at Landmark School itself, as well as an additional 91 years of teaching outside of Landmark School's walls. So we can speak to what we're doing here on campus, but we can also speak to our work beyond the walls of the campus. To begin, I would like to introduce each of the panelists, and I'm going to ask them to share a fun landmark fact with you so that we get to learn a little bit about who they are before we do our deep dive and geek out around the teaching of literacy. So to begin, I'm going to introduce Janet Parody, who is our high school language arts department head.
All right. My fun fact is that in the early 2000s, I was offered a chance to have a working sabbatical at a school in Boston, right across the street from Fenway Park, which was really interesting. And I was an on-site consultant for a year, and it was just one of the best years of my life. It was wonderful.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for sharing that. Next, our panelist is Jeff Russell, who is the co-language arts department head at our elementary middle school. Thanks for being here, Jeff.
Thank you. My fun fact is that when I started working at Landmark, as I was getting to know people, I made a connection, and the connection was that I met up with my first grade teacher, who also worked here and subsequently taught me in a graduate course later on down the road.
So love that full circle. First grade to graduate school. Well done. Our next panelist tonight is Megan Siebens, who is our elementary and middle school academic dean. Welcome.
Thanks. My fun fact is that in the very first outreach course that I taught at our summer institute, as if I weren't already nervous enough,
Right.
my middle school boyfriend was sitting in the back.
Okay, also full circle, but not in such a positive way. Moving on, Beth Dietz, who is our reading supervisor and testing coordinator at our elementary middle school. Hi, Beth.
Hello. My fun fact is that I moved here from Akron, Ohio, also hometown of LeBron James, in order to teach at Landmark because my cousin was a student here.
Very cool, very cool. And then finally tonight, we have Christine Barrett, our literacy tutorial department head. And your fun Landmark fact, Christine.
Fun fact is, about 20 plus years ago, I tutored Danny DeVito. Of course, not Danny DeVito that you all know. It's a different Danny DeVito, tall and thin, and he is infamous.
Infamous.
To me, but not to anybody else.
Love it. Great. Thank you guys for being here and for your willingness to have this discussion with us tonight. So let me set the stage a little bit. Some questions have been submitted in advance, so I have some already teed up for us. So I'm going to kick us off with some questions that have been submitted. And again, for those of you who are just joining us now, I want to again remind you that the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will allow you to submit additional questions. And we really encourage you to do that. So as you hear something that we're talking about that gives you a question that you want to address, feel free to do that. And so at this point, we're going to start us off. And Beth, I think we're going to begin with you. And group, I really invite us all to, have a lively discussion and feel free to add to the conversation as it seems appropriate and you feel comfortable doing so. So Beth, what are the most basic components of teaching reading effectively? Ooh, big, heavy question.
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, I like that one. So I think the results and the advice of the National Reading Panel still ring true for that. In thinking of the basic components for teaching reading effectively, thinking phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension as an overarching theme, but thinking more in terms of depending on the stage of development for students. So at the kindergarten level, there'll be heavy emphasis on that phonemic awareness and phonics, and then really setting the stage for fluency by doing those foundational skills. And then thinking more vocabulary comprehension, more in the language realm, where you're not reading it yet, but you're developing those to kind of really reinforce those language strands. So that is, but then thinking third grades, when you're thinking of mainstream classroom, more heavy emphasis on the fluency and the vocabulary comprehension. But this is thinking more mainstream. I think a really important component when thinking those students that struggle with acquiring literacy skills is to layer on that diagnostic prescriptive approach, so that you can kind of prescribe different dosages of those 5 main components, and kind of really targeted within each of those levels so that you're individualizing for these students that just really need that time on task to be so targeted for them to get the most benefits out of that reading instruction.
That's great. I like when you said layering on. I think we get so caught up and we have to teach individual skills related to each of the components, and to honor the idea that they need to happen lockstep, and you have to be building background knowledge while you're developing phonological awareness, and then the more abstract phonemic awareness. Any other thoughts around what Beth was saying as it relates to how we're teaching reading to students?
I would say at the high school level, because our readers come to us at a much older age with a lot of instruction, I think of it a little more of a wall. And, the wall doesn't have a great structure because it's missing pieces of it. So you need the layering like you talked about, which I love. But you also need extra layering in those holes. So it's kind of, I feel like where we make the most inroads with students who struggle at the high school level is finding where the holes are and then using all the pieces, their strengths, to build and fill those holes. So that's why we start with phonemic awareness in my department, even though they're in high school.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's a skill that's taught as a kindergartner. But they haven't been able to develop it for whatever reason. So our job is to figure out, what they need and how to fill that.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Hmm.
Any other thoughts?
And what stuck out to me was this idea of kind of meeting students where they're at. So, just thinking about when you're working on specific skills, evaluating students and having a baseline to then move on. I mean, we do that in writing as well. So, but having tutored students in reading as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
having a little bit of background there.
Yeah, because kind of with that same analogy of the visual of the wall, right? Our students are so dynamic and they have such great problem solving skills. They can climb up really high. But the problem is they will eventually fall if they don't have all the pieces. They won't be able to kind of get to their highest point.
And the diagnostic prescriptive piece is lesson by lesson.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
every lesson you teach
Yeah.
determines how they do determines how you teach the next lesson.
I was thinking the same thing, that whole idea of diagnostic prescriptive. I've heard that since I arrived on this campus, but I think more and more that that's such a gift that allows me to honor where the student currently is and then make really purposeful decisions about what I'm going to do today to help that student be successful. And I really like what you just said about the structure. And I'm thinking in real time right now, we have the structure that's required to give them the framework to be successful and structured literacy, right? So in fact, we are through structured literacy, building a solid frame that provides future success. Nice. Janet,
Yeah.
Next question for you. What are the most basic components to teaching writing? So we get so in the throes of structured literacy around reading with the science of reading, but it's so important to think about the reciprocity between the two. So when you think about the teaching of writing, what are those basic starting building blocks that we really need to be concerned with?
Yeah, and a lot of that depends on the individual students and where they're at. And we look at what they can and cannot do, and we start where they cannot and start building in those foundational skills. And it could be sentence skills, and you do a lot at EMS with sentence skills. It could be the components of a basic paragraph. Or then you take that and you elaborate on that, and you make a larger, meatier paragraph. And then you chunk those into the bigger forms of writing. But you're practicing those skills over and over again. And using, hopefully at the high school anyway, thought-provoking content to have them read about and talk about and then write about.
So the high school brain's leaning into that complexity of really interesting content.
Yes.
In order to elicit some written response where they can start becoming meta-linguistic in the sense that they're able to evaluate some decisions they're making when they write. At EMS, when we're working with our younger students, Jeff, they're not always using reading to elicit written responses.
Yes.
Isn't that correct?
Correct.
So how do you guys start getting them to create written expression, paragraphs, sentences, phrases without being able to access text?
Sure. So, classes that we kind of put together as students come into the school year are really based on their ability level. And a part of that is their reading level. And so you always want to be considering that because you do want students to be writing about content and information that they're interested in. So in order to get that content to, let's say, lower level elementary school classes or middle school classes where students are kind of emerging readers or they're having a tough time, we use theme-based content. And really what that does is it kind of puts the teacher in the driver's seat to preview vocabulary, think about how much vocabulary the students are going to be exposed to, and then teach it in a way that makes sense. So, in a way that is hierarchical. Oftentimes we start at the sentence level because it's kind of a midpoint. You can work up or down from there. Right? So you can think about, with the simple sentence structure, if you're working down, you're thinking about the different parts of speech within that and how those can go together. And then if you're working up, you think about scaffolding paragraphs from there and how the students can take that. But you want the students to really work at that sentence level at the elementary and middle school stage so that they can really learn the parts of speech and how to shift the language appropriately or how to use it appropriately.
That's so cool.
One thing I'm hearing through both of these conversations
Yeah.
that's really interesting, we are talking about, you know, that day-to-day lesson planning and making sure that we're honing in on each whole and really individualizing every day. But I'm also hearing how we're never losing sight of the big picture and thinking about where are we taking this kid in the end, and you can't do one without the other.
Right. And this is where I'm just having fun, kind of geeking out with you guys right now. Because what I'm hearing you talk about too is developing language at the word level. And you specifically were talking about vocabulary development. And then to combine what you were saying with what Beth was saying about 5 minutes ago, you can't expect good comprehension, the final result of why we read, to easily happen if we haven't been orally exposed to good vocabulary, so that it's already in your wheelhouse, so that when you are confronted with that word in text, you decode it accurately and go, oh, I recognize that. I remember writing about it, and now I understand what I'm reading.
As well as background knowledge.
And the background knowledge
Layering that in,
that,
so. it
that
makes more
builds there.
sense.
Right.
Yeah. So through the act of writing, you're building some literacy skills that are almost, hate to call them soft skills, but they're unexpected benefits of the explicit work that you're doing. Very cool, guys. Let's go. Christine, I think I'm going to throw this one at you. Through our work together at Landmark, I have seen your commitment to what the science has proven to us about best practices for teaching reading and writing. What have you seen as a result of this commitment? And maybe a little bit of a background story, if that feels good.
So I have seen, well, I've been here a long time. And so I feel like the number one best practice we have is that we keep the student in front of us and at the forefront of what we do.
Yeah.
So we take that, right, and then we add in what we know about what works with our students, which we've seen work. And then my personal experience, I went to college in the 80s, and then I learned full language. And then I thought, great, I'm going to learn, now I can teach it, I think, but I'm not really sure what this is about. I think it's just going to magically happen. That's kind of what they told me. And then I came here and I learned how to actually take apart words and what the patterns were and the sounds. And then all of a sudden I thought, wait, that actually makes sense, even though that's not at all what I just spent 4 years, much to my parents' chagrin, learning how to teach. And then what I saw was, wow, I can figure out what they don't know. And I actually have a way to teach it by using the 6 Landmark teaching principles. That were, yeah, fancy title. So by including the student in the learning process and providing opportunities for success and using multi-modalities and having those teaching strategies on top of what I learned here, I saw the success. And then I started reading because, at the time I was 22. And so now as I grew in my professional career, I started reading literature and research. And I thought, wait, this really aligns with what I see working
Right.
in my class. And so when the student gets now, when I can talk about how a sound is made with the student by talking about their oral motor feedback in making the sound, let's say S, right? And then I can talk about what letter attaches to that. And then I can talk about what spelling rules involve different letters in their sounds. It all came together. And so I feel like what I have learned here as a teacher and has just paralleled very nicely with what has come out in the latest scientific science of reading.
It's awesome, right?
I'm thinking,
Go for it. Yeah.
I was thinking about my own experience as a student, and I was a successful student, but I was never taught a rule for anything. And coming to Landmark and being able to break down the phonology, the orthography, the morphology, the grammar, and just be like, if someone had just told me
So true.
there's a reason to do each of these things, I wouldn't have had to just figure it out through osmosis, which was how I apparently went.
Exactly. It kind of gets at the fact that like, if you didn't really need all those things, you did learn it. But the student with dyslexia next to you couldn't without those things. But if you would have been taught that like systematic approach, you probably would have thrived with it. So like giving that to all as your instruction, giving that structured approach to everybody will help everybody succeed and not leave anybody. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I feel like it's like a, code, right? It's the code breaker. And our students are so great at problem solving. So it seems like such a natural fit to give them the code on how to figure out how to break down reading. And it's the same with
And
writing.
writing.
Yeah. I mean, it really allows us to build like a language as a faculty and help the students kind of understand that language, whether it's the terminology that we use is the same or not, we're applying that language when we're teaching classes. And therefore the faculty, there's carryover between departments, there's carryover between modalities.
I think you bring up another really good point about the gift of teaching here, in a sense, is that every teacher is responsible for the teaching of reading, for the teaching of writing, for the teaching of study skills, beyond just their content areas. And so students, as they navigate their day, get to experience similar cueing across all of those different spaces. And it allows them to relax and say, okay, in the apparent inconsistency of the way I'm interacting with text, there's a support system around me that's super consistent and predictable and affirming for me. And that's pretty awesome.
And you know what?
Yeah,
It
what do you got?
creates a safe space.
Sure.
And that safe space cannot be emphasized.
Yes.
It really can't, because when it's predictable and it feels safe, then that's where learning can occur.
Yeah. And it's not, I love what you just said too, because it's not a safe space about share with me your feelings today. Like, was everything okay in the hallway? The safe space is very academic.
Yeah.
And it is this particular vowel team produces these sounds. And it's these sounds. So let's practice those, let's own those, let's get comfortable. And then in that sense, you're creating like academic safeness, right? In the face of what isn't always feeling good.
Right.
We also kind of went a little bit to that place of systematic instruction versus other approaches to reading. And there is, some chatter in the field that, well, not all students need a systematic approach. But Megan, the way you brought it up, I think was so important, that wouldn't everybody have benefited around the clarity of explicit instruction, whether or not they were more naturally inclined to pick it up in an easier way? And I often think about when I'm driving away from a school district, wouldn't even our best readers potentially have been even better readers if they had received that explicit instruction in addition to complement what was already kind of clicking naturally for them? Any thoughts about that?
I think that comes down to pace and individualization for me. As
Okay.
I think about every student would absolutely benefit from that. And it's about how much repetition they're gonna need and how quickly you can move to the next piece. When Christine was talking about our 6 teaching principles, that repetition and automatization is very important for the type of students that we have. So that we can, because we're working, using their strengths, but building weaknesses and giving that opportunity to go back and spiral back into the same topics repeatedly is necessary for students who perhaps don't need the strategies or explicit instruction. They're going to benefit from it and be able to move at a faster pace and get to the next level even more quickly. And we're just going to build learners who are more capable of engaging with text and writing and reading text independently. No, go.
I think that's really the case with writing instruction as well. National studies show that our students across the board in the United States are not really proficient writers in many cases. So many students who aren't diagnosed could benefit from systematic, explicit teaching of writing. And it doesn't mean just give them a graphic organizer.
Right.
We have to show them how to use it. We have to model those approaches. We have to make that self-talk evident by making meta-linguistic skills really apparent and clear to the students. And that's how they become better writers. And I think that would benefit any student in any classroom.
You bring up such an important point. One of the things I learned from you many years ago was that our teaching of expressive language isn't just oral language written on a piece of paper.
Mhm.
That there's a whole set of rules that govern conversational language that allow us to use slang, contractions. We can speak in phrases. Yet, when we ask our students to put their thoughts on paper, they have to predict where the communication is going to break down, because the reader isn't in the same space
Mhm.
that the writer is in.
Right.
So when that lack of clarity occurs, there isn't somebody to say, wait, what did you mean by that?
Right.
So how do our systems help students step outside the process, whether it's reading or writing, and reflect on when is it going to break down for whomever may be reading this? Any thoughts about that, guys?
I think that the cohesive devices, such as, and jump in,
Oh, yeah.
the conjunctions, the transitional words and phrases, those single words or phrases that carry such deep meaning and show connections between ideas. If I say, however, it means I'm contradicting one with the other. If I say, although, I'm showing a cause-effect relationship. And we need to teach those words and devices very explicitly to help kids see how those pieces glue all their ideas together in certain ways.
Yeah, and I would echo that, I mean, just the idea of teaching those structures deliberately, so as I mentioned before, teaching that, doing all that sentence work where you start off with a simple sentence and then you have students master that and the parts within it, and then moving to compounding complex sentences and building, syntactic flexibility where they can shift phrases around and clauses around. And what you see is you really see growth in those spaces because they learn those sentence structures as almost tools to use to clarify their ideas. But then again, at the word level, thinking about like synonyms and antonyms and just
Mm.
practicing that all the
Right.
time, you know, so it's just a lot of repetition. A lot of just oral rehearsal prior to the writing.
Yeah.
So that's a necessary
So
thing
important.
is having the students kind of talk through the scripts and the structures before they apply it to their writing.
And I think one thing I see out there is that there's this pressure of time.
Mhm.
So a lot of what we're talking about are what seem to be considered very basic skills.
Mhm.
I'm going to teach a sentence, my kids are in high school,
Right.
or I can't belabor these vocabulary words,
Mhm.
but it actually expedites the end product because now the kids have the tools to put everything together, and we just need to have a little bit of faith that if you're gonna build those foundational skills, they're going to build better houses.
And we see that
Yeah, we do.
year after year, we see.
Yeah.
I also see that mirrored a little bit in some of the pushback that sometimes we get from students. Especially if they're in the reading program that we use that develops phonemic awareness. Because they don't conceptualize that as a reading lesson. They're like, wait a minute, why am I manipulating sounds? And how does this relate to my future success?
Yeah.
And attacking a word that isn't familiar to me.
Yeah, the key to selling that program, which we do 50 times every year, is really helping the students see, I guess, intellectualizing it at their level. So showing them the brain, showing them how, you know, what science of reading says about how your brain maps sounds. And then talking about, you know, that you're constantly making connections in your brain, and we're trying to build these connections. The only way they're built is by repetition, and you were never, you know, you didn't, at the time you got this, or maybe you never did get it, you didn't make the connection. And so, as I tell my readers, you only have 4 years in high school, right? And this is your time. Nobody's going to teach you the sounds when you leave high school. So this is it. And you have a, you know, you work on that during high school, you have a whole long, hopefully beautiful, long life in front of you that you can use those skills and really benefit from learning to read. So
You bring up referencing research. I think that is so important for all of our students, and I don't care if it's a second grader up to a 12th grader. They lean in when you can say, let me tell you what scientists are doing in this field. And we are fortunate at Landmark, you know, and many schools do have partnerships with researchers. But we did have a researcher here a couple of years ago that really unpacked the word yet that we use a lot on campus. So when we're working with students, we're like, you're not getting that yet, but it's gonna happen with some work. And this researcher from MGH shared that there are functional MRI slides showing that word yet is physically changing in the brain that is allowing that pathway to happen more efficiently. So I think that's super cool.
Yeah.
And we recently had another researcher here who talked about the idea of orthographic mapping. And what I took away from that I think was so powerful is that for our students on our campuses, it takes a long time. And I know we keep bringing up the word repetition here, but this is really the power of repetition and the gift of time to do that. But it takes a very long time for some brains to map those orthographic being the letters. As we geek out talking about orthographic, let's just call them what they are. It takes a long time for those individual letters to be recognized as individual letters of groups. But the really amazing thing I heard him say was that once our students map it, they own it forever. And they can't take it away. So yes, you graduate from second grade, you own second grade. Like nobody can take that experience away from you. Well, guess what? It's true with reading. Once you break the code, once you've mapped it, you have it forever. Right? And it took a lot of work, but there's a payoff for that,
Ownership.
which is pretty cool.
it kind of just reminds me of a theory. I don't have scientific research, but
We'll get it for you.
my theory is because we do have high schoolers who come and we give them phonemic awareness, And all of a sudden they get it and their parents will say, but wait, they got that in second grade, or we did that in third grade. I do think, I don't know what the instruction looked like in their second or third grade. That might be one of the issues. I don't know. But I do feel like the more mature brain is somehow, it's kind of like the word yet, right? They can all of a sudden hear that it's a possibility. And that alone gives them like the ability to be open to that instruction on top of what we do. I don't know.
I think that's also the integration of how we do it. So we're not teaching phonemic awareness in a vacuum, even though they don't automatically make that connection to reading and writing. We are explicitly trying to make that connection for them. So here are the sounds in the language. Here's how you can manipulate those sounds. Look, here are some words you have to read. Look how those sounds are being manipulated. Let's work on spelling those and using that mapping to get the output of it. And then we're putting it all together. And as you mentioned earlier, it's not just in that one space, in that one classroom. Then you also have your science teacher turning to you and saying, if you say, I don't know how to spell that, you say, I bet you do. Let's think about this. What are the sounds you're hearing? So it's always being reintegrated for them.
Yeah.
And from a writing perspective, it's, just thinking about just metacognitive, talking to the students and having them kind of discover how the pieces come together. How does learning grammar or learning the parts of speech come together with your sentence work that then applies to your paragraph work, multi-paragraph work, so on and so forth. So that metacognitive work or kind of explicitly showing the students how these pieces fit together is always beneficial. We're always trying to do that.
And maybe it is that ability to think more metacognitively at that age to make those connections.
Yeah, that could be it. And including the student and learning process, one of the principles.
That's right. Yes.
One of the questions that comes up a lot, whether it's someone who might be applying to Landmark through the admissions process, or a friend of a Landmark family, is there a specific reading curricula that we embrace, like an Orton Gillingham or a Wilson tutorial? And we don't. So we are structured literacy. We are multisensory to honor that kinesthetic modality and getting kids to move and not just passively be a participant. But can somebody speak to why we aren't just an OG or a Wilson type of institution?
I can start this conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts around here. And one clarification I want to make is that those are seated in the science of reading.
Correct. Yeah.
And so are we. So there's so much about what we do and how we teach that aligns very directly with those programs. But what we are given is the ability to take pieces of all of these different scientific programming and put them together and make sure that we are not just working on phonology. We are building in all of these other aspects. And what I don't want anyone to think is that what we do is piecemeal, because that negates the amount of thought and diagnostic work that we do to appropriately address a kid's reading skills, and the depth of knowledge that we try to build within our literacy teachers, because you have to be a linguist, you have to be a grammarian, you have to be a rocket scientist to do the work that we do.
Any other thoughts?
Pretty thorough.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that makes-
I mean, we see students, I mean, at the high school level, see students who have gone through the programs. And for whatever reason, it hasn't stuck. So, it's time to try pulling the best practices from all the programs that we can. So I would say that is a big reason why.
I love the quote, "You are no smarter today than you will be tomorrow." And I think it really applies to all the work that we collectively do. We constantly are in our own professional development, reading articles, emailing them to each other saying, "I just saw this. I don't know what I think. Can you give this a read and can we unpack this together?" It allows us to just go back to that diagnostic gift, to work with the puzzle that is the child sitting in front of us. And what do we need to do, either individually or as a community, to solve the problem and to find success? And I don't think I would like being bootstrapped to a specific approach.
Yes.
But it puts, I think, on all of us an incredible responsibility to make sure we keep asking really important questions and challenging what we're hearing. Because like your experience coming out of college, which was a different reading instruction approach than what you're doing now, I think that kind of goes back to, you're no smarter today than you will be tomorrow. Like, I love the science of reading. I'm going to trust it, but I'm always going to keep a little question in the back of my mind based upon what I'm seeing my students doing, right?
And to always think about what that student in front of you needs.
Absolutely.
So maybe one student can manipulate that orally.
Yep.
But the next student needs to have it on note cards and they need to move them around. So we're always thinking, okay, what approach will be the best for that student?
Right. So true. Okay, so we have a parent who asked a question earlier. Their child is dyslexic. She's apparently doing really well in 8th grade. But the parents are noticing that she's struggling with spelling and some reading fluency. And as parents, they want to figure out, what does she need to do as she prepares for that next step, which is going into high school. And we see this a lot. Students starting to make good progress, but they do have that dyslexic or dyslexia diagnosis. Any thoughts in the years we're working with students about how we offer some advice to a parent of a child that's going through that challenge?
We were talking about that earlier, and I think a lot of us thought our biggest suggestion would be to have an evaluation done to really kind of fine tune the areas of learning that are the most in need. And then from that, evaluate what might be the best next step.
I think the grades are a hard read on how a kid is actually doing. Especially, we've talked about our problem solvers, our really bright kids can often compensate for their own challenges in ways that might get them a good grade, but doesn't necessarily mean that they can work efficiently. And I think parents are the ones at home being able to look at that and say, like, this is taking you so much longer than it should, or you don't actually know what you're doing, but you're getting an A on that. And I think that's the frustration that, and a professional is really going to be the one to be able to pull that up.
I mean, when we think about the idea of being meta aware, when a child says, "I don't know why I got the A," that's diagnostically
Right,
significant. I
right.
want a student to be able to say, "I got an A because I was able to do A, B, and C," right? And
And
that's awesome.
sometimes it's the duck feet under the water
Right,
that they're working so hard
sure.
just to stay on top
Yep.
of the surface.
We have a question that's coming live. Super exciting. All right, so here we go. This is from Charlotte. And to the whole panel, do you have any techniques around how to implement summer reading and writing, specifically with the high school student? Summer reading and writing.
Oh,
So this is, yes,
Great.
well, kind of. Being a mother of 3 boys who despised summer reading. Yeah, I would say one suggestion I have for reluctant high school readers is I'm finding right now a lot of success with student reading books that are written in verse. The pages are very manageable. There's limited text, but they're really rich. And so they can get a lot of meaning from it. One book, Jason Reynolds, Long Way Down, fabulous book for that. And it right away gets to the heart of the matter. So students are immediately engaged. So something like that, where you can say, you can read 10 pages and what that looks like is really probably a page and a half in a regular book, but it's 10 pages. And so they then become more motivated by that. So that's kind of my little.
I love that.
I would add to that, say a student that has required reading, that
Yeah.
there's no choice in it. Helping to micro unit for the students so that it isn't this huge looming task. So break down the summer into a series of weeks and
Yeah.
say, all right, so week 1, you need to get to this point. Week 2, you need to get to this point. Help them break down the writing task if they have to respond, which questions they're going to respond to, or how they're going to format theirs.
That's really smart.
I was just gonna say sometimes it's also just beneficial, if possible, to just have a neutral person to check in
Yeah.
2 or 3 times over the summer,
Yeah.
so that the parents are not
Sure.
battling that, so
Yeah.
that,
I don't recommend high school parents try to get their high school students to write over the
Yeah.
summer. I could get away with it when my kids were younger and we had a family newsletter and they'd write articles and we could send it out.
Yeah.
But high school is but if they could just get kids to think about the structure of language and just a quick example, if you want your student to accomplish 3 tasks over the weekend, put them on cards. Talk with the student about what order they want to do them in, why they chose that order. They're showing the whole sort of skeleton of how you think metalinguistically
Yep.
about sequencing and ordering, which goes to writing.
Mm.
But we'll make them write at school.
That's
A
great.
lot.
I'm being mindful of time and we're approaching about 10 minutes to 8.
Mm.
And our plan was to engage with a little bit of a speed round.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna kind of end this discussion. I know some of us have already kind of teased our speed round stuff already, but that's okay. So first of all, I just want to really thank you guys for your candor during this discussion and the honesty. We're going to transition to what we're calling our speed round. Each of our panelists are going to share maybe a tip, a strategy that they find really powerful, or just some advice that they found especially helpful for when they're working with their students. And so not in any particular order, but Beth, I think I'm gonna have you kick us off
Sure.
with our speed rounds. What do you got?
Yeah, so I would say like a recommendation for struggling readers is to make sure that they're hearing books read aloud to them, or even books on tape that are above their instructional or functional reading level, so more on par with what they're able to understand, like their verbal reasoning. So could be several grades above what they are able to read. So more thinking their grade level or even above their grade level in order to develop that vocabulary, that background knowledge that they're going to need once they are able to break the code more successfully. So when they are able to decode those words, they'll need it as part of their oral language in order to be successful.
I love that strategy because when I'm hearing you say that, what I'm reminded is it's almost like lesson planning. Define your purpose first.
Yeah.
So the oral presentation of that book is not to take away an opportunity to do our summer reading, but it is purposefully designed for vocabulary development. stronger syntactical structures that we're just not hearing when we converse. And that rich background knowledge that is going to support future reading comprehension. So take advantage of books on tape, but just remember you're doing it for that reason, not to replace eyes in front of text, which is great. Awesome. Megan,
Yeah.
what do you got for us?
I was actually gonna kind of piggyback on what Beth is talking about, because taking in that oral language is so important, and just building literacy. So reading to your kids or listening to books together. But in addition to that, having an interaction. So often, if we passively take in text, we aren't always picking up on the nuances, or we're just not even paying attention sometimes. So modeling for your student how you are comprehending and what is important to you will elicit a deeper conversation about the reading that you're doing, and also prepare them for recognizing when they're not comprehending and coming up with some strategies to fix that.
So I know that we all share a particular love, maybe too strong a word, for Marianne Wolf. And Marianne, and her latest book is in our recommended reading list that we're going to mail out with the recording of this presentation. But in her first book, Proust and the Squid, she said that the gift of reading is the ability to insert a pause and then to think against that pause. And that's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Modeling what Marianne believes is the gift of reading is not just going as fast as you can through the text, but slow your roll and give our readers permission to pause and to think, which is so important. Right? Jeff, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so I just kind of back to that meta-linguistic idea of kind of when it comes to writing and thinking about what parents can do to kind of help their students around writing is just oral rehearsal, simple oral scripts where if they have an experience, typically something that's concrete, a quick introductory sentence, the who, the what, the where, and the when. And then, a simple first, then, next, after that, and finally, a little narrative structure as a little retell so that it gets away from that one word answer of, what did you do in school today?
Right.
Stuff. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so just, having a little script like that you just can implement and use is always good.
Janet?
I think my biggest thing is finding content your kids will get into. And they may not even think they're going to get into it, but I'm doing a slam poem now with my freshmen, and it's about giving up your hopes and dreams to buy a packaged idea of what success is. And we are having the richest discussions about what that means and the symbols the poet uses. And they're going to write about it. But it's just so cool to see kids wrap their heads around all that.
Right.
And to delve into it and enjoy the discussion.
Yeah. You bring us to the intersection of technology and video games and screen time. The developing brain is so programmed to want color feedback, sound feedback, rewards from that video game. And then we value text, which on the surface are black symbols on a white fields that the brain finds inherently boring when it's been natively involved in the beauty of technology. So it's the contents that we have to get them past that boring visual presentation to what the message is. But once you get them hooked, it's pretty amazing watching what happens.
And touching paper and pencil.
Yes. Christine.
So I think one quick fun thing you could do as a family, pending, is if you're gonna, you know how families will do vocabulary word of the day? So, you know, science has shown that you need lots of exposures to words to really be able to own that word. So instead of just a flat definition, you could play that game like two truths and a lie,
Mhm.
right? So then everybody takes turn using the word in a sentence. And somebody eventually uses it incorrectly, and then that would be, you know, they'd be the one that says the lie, right? And so you actually can talk about part of speech it belongs in, then you can hear it being used in a variety of ways. You could maybe add an ending onto it, and then all of a sudden it becomes a word that you can have a better chance at owning.
You own it.
So good dinner table,
Yeah,
but also good commuting.
right,
Like
right,
if you're driving around, right, shut off the radio and do that.
right.
Cool. Well, guys, we're fast approaching 8 o'clock. And I want to thank you for being here. So I'm gonna do a little end of presentation housekeeping at this point. So thanks a lot. Thanks for sending in questions. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to mention that the next Landmark Learns presentation, so mark your calendars, is going to be another webinar. It's going to be on Tuesday, the 28th of February from 7 to 8 p.m. It will feature a special guest speaker, Nicole Patton Terry. She is professor of education at Florida State University and the director of Florida Center for Reading Research. She's going to be talking about how educators and parents can deliver on what the science of reading tells us for all learners. So you can see that we've kind of teed her up talking about all learners really do benefit from this, not just those learners with learning differences. It's going to be an hour-long virtual presentation. So be on the lookout for emails promoting this event in the coming days. And then there's going to be at least one more that will happen as well later in the year. So in closing, I want to thank you for attending. And I want to thank you for our panelists tonight. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the Landmark School Stage Company and the tech department, as well as the IT department here at Landmark School for spearheading the technology that was necessary to make this possible. I know that I couldn't have done that. That is not a place where I geek out, but they're incredible in their ability to do that. So thank you very much. Finally, we will send a recording of the webinar to all of our registered attendees. And I look forward to having you back on our next webinar on the 28th of February. So thank you all.
Yeah.
This
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.